Hi everyone, I am Kailey Kornhauser. I'm really excited to be talking with you all from all the way over in Oregon on the west coast of the United States. So it's really cool to be joining you virtually. I'm gonna start by sharing a little bit about me and my background, but I'll get into talking about All Bodies on Bikes, and maybe you've seen the film that we did with Shimano, talking about body size and biking and bike packing especially. I'm gonna do a little bit of the talk and when I say we, me and the other person in the film, Marley Blonsky, give when we try to inform people and educate about these topics about body size inclusivity in cycling. So I'll just jump right in. And if there's any lag or anything, let me know. And I don't know how I'll fix it, but I can repeat myself. um, so that's my name spelled there, and you can see my email and website and Instagram handle. If you've got any questions after this or you want to connect, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk privately. I know sometimes people have pretty personal questions when it comes to body size and cycling, or you have a specific question you didn't get to ask, or maybe you're coming to Oregon and you want someone to go riding with. Reach out to me there. So I started biking in 2010. I moved to college, and at least in the US, like a lot of college students don't have cars. And the town that I moved to for college was you kind of needed a car or a bike or something to get to the grocery store and work. Things weren't that close to each other, not really walkable. I never really biked before. I grew up in Chicago, which is a place where not very many people bike to get around. And I did not know that adults rode bikes for fun. And I'd never really heard of that. So I kind of begrudgingly got a bike because I needed to get around my town, and I wasn't like all that excited about it, and I didn't really like having to bike around. I really wished I had a car, but I just couldn't afford it. And eventually I started seeing all of these people that were my age and they were on bikes, but they were doing it like recreationally, not just to get around. And I thought, I kind of thought they looked cool, really, rather than thinking they were having fun. I just thought, like, wow, they kind of look hip and like cool. I kind of want to be their friends. And eventually I became friends with some of those people and started biking for fun. When I first started biking, it was just around town with that group. And I've always been a person in a larger body. I refer to myself as fat, and I'll talk about why I do that in a couple slides. But most of the people I was riding with were in smaller bodies, and I assumed that my body would start to look like theirs the more I rode. But eventually I realized that that probably wasn't going to happen for me. I went on my first multi-day bike ride in 2016. I rode 7 days across the state of Iowa, which is in central US, and was one of the larger people out on that group ride. And I still made it across, but there I was, still larger by the end of that ride, and kept riding and started bike packing, and things weren't really changing about my body. I was getting a lot more confident on the bike, and I was starting to come into my own and feel like I was a cyclist. But I started having these questions like, oh, what does it mean to be a person in a larger body who rides a bike? Why don't I look like other people? Does that mean I'm not a real cyclist? And dealing with my own self-esteem issues, but also dealing with challenges finding clothing that fit and bike equipment that worked for me. Um, in 2018, I got a scholarship by Lael Wilcox. If you're familiar with her, she's a endurance bike pack cyclist, and she provided me and my friend that you can see here in the bottom right with funding and the opportunity to bike across Alaska. So I biked from Seward, which is kind of at the south of Alaska, up to the Arctic Ocean. And it's a 1,000-mile trip, and we had all, self-sufficient, carrying our own gear. And a lot of that, 500 miles of it's on gravel. And during that trip especially, I started to think like, well, now I'm really a cyclist. I've bike packed this 1,000-mile route. It's pretty hard, and I did it. But here I am, I'm still fat, and and kind of questioning. You can see this picture, these two in the corners, that I'm wearing this like purple jacket. It's not really a raincoat, but it was the best I could find. There wasn't really a rain jacket that fit me before the trip. And I started to get maybe a little angry, like, okay, I'm out here doing these things, but they don't even make a rain jacket for me to do this activity. And so I started writing about what it was like to be a larger person biking, and some of the challenges and some of the like awesome things that that being a person in a larger body brings, and got the chance then to write an article for Bicycling magazine. It's a US publication, and I ended up, this is a picture on this slide of me on the cover of that magazine in 2020. And then of course, if you've seen it, then Marley and I, another fat cyclist, got the chance to be featured in this film with Shimano that came out this March, called All Bodies on Bikes. And that's kind of the public facing stuff that's come along through talking and writing about body size. But there's a lot of work that is less public, obviously talks like this, but we also, Marley and I work a lot with companies in consulting them, both, you know, bike manufacturers, clothing companies, component companies, bike organizations, about, you know, how to create inclusive culture, but also how to make equipment that works for people in larger bodies. So it's just turned into a kind of a pretty big side gig. I'm a full-time PhD student, but now I do a lot of bike advocacy work, which is just amazing for people that look like me and people who don't look like me. Really, it's just about getting more people on bikes. And so I now I'm going to jump into kind of the talk that Marley and I often give to organizations. And then this is kind of the outline. I'll start with some background. It's going to feel like, whoa, I came to this bike presentation and this isn't that much about bikes, for a couple slides. And then we'll get back to bikes, I promise, talk about clothing and equipment. And we won't spend too long talking about marketing, but I'll talk a little bit about the importance of featuring people in larger bodies in marketing. So like I said, we're going to jump into some general background about body size, and some of the previous work that people before me did to make the space so that we can have conversations like this. So before every conversation I have about body size inclusivity, I like to go through these ground rules, not as kind of like rules that we have to stick to and follow, or we get punished or something, just as some guiding ideas that I try to hold myself to. But also, this is a learning space. For a lot of people, this is the first time they're talking about body size, and it can be kind of stressful and scary to talk about body size. We all have bodies and we all have relationships to those bodies. Sometimes they're positive and negative, and it can be personal. So please ask questions. Don't be afraid to speak up. And these are, yeah, again, just guiding principles, really. So the first one is that fat is not a bad word. You hear me use the word fat to describe myself. You know, at the end of the day, the word fat is a neutral descriptor of a person's size, but of course, we have for a long time used fat and associated it with negative connotations. So I think we could all think of some negative things that we associate: fat as lazy, fat as ugly. These things that, you know, if we think for 2 more seconds, we realize that they're not inherently true. The word fat doesn't actually mean those things, but we have associated them with those words. And because of that, fat has become an insult. So part of the work of using the word fat to describe myself is an act of reclaiming the word. But I will say, I don't use the word fat to describe people that I don't know or that haven't invited me to use the word fat to describe them, because it's quite a charged word. So I try to use words like people in larger bodies, or you know, bigger people. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. I try really hard to refrain from diet talk, and I encourage other people to as well. I think it's become a bit more popularized now to realize that talking about diets and diet culture can be really damaging to the people around us. We don't know what people's relationships with food are. And talking about food and having food in groups is certainly lovely and community building, but just being careful about how we talk about restricted eating, because we don't know how what we're saying is affecting other people. The third ground rule is to not body shame. I think this is a lot easier to work on with other people, but also I encourage you to not body shame yourself, and that's really hard. That might be for a lot of people a lot harder than not body shaming other people. So we can talk about ways to try and do that, but it's a challenge and it's ongoing for me too. Even though I talk about this all the time, I have to work on not body shaming myself every day. Beware of microaggressions. So I think we're pretty familiar now with what microaggressions are, but what do they look like in this space? And I think an example that I like to point out is when we're out on the road biking or on a mountain bike trail, and you come up on somebody and you pass them, and they're a person in a larger body. And as you pass, you say something to that person, intending it to be kind of a community building, like, hey, we're out here together. But maybe the thing you say is, you've got this, or way to get out there. That type of comment. It sounds like a compliment, and you probably mean it as a compliment. But how's it being received by the person who is on the other end of that compliment? To me, it often feels like the person thinks that they have more experience than me, or that they don't consider me part of the biking community yet, and that I'm working to get there. Maybe they're assuming that I'm riding a bike as a weight loss exercise, or that I'm out there um, because I want to look like them eventually. There's a lot of assumption in that comment. And so I encourage people instead to just use we phrases, we've got this, like, we can do it, or just say hello. There's plenty of kind things you can say to people as you pass by. I certainly don't want to encourage people to say nothing to each other. And some people have asked me that in the past, but no, I think you can say things to just think about how they're being received. And that goes along with that fifth ground rule, to trust intent, but acknowledge impact. Um, I, I totally trust that people that say those types of comments mean them well, but also I can acknowledge how they felt to me. And so I encourage you that's a good practice just in general in life. And then finally, celebrate your body for what it can do. All of our bodies in some ways support us and in other ways limit us. And I like to focus on what my body can do, and as a way to be joyful about biking. And I think biking is a great way to show ourselves what our bodies are capable of. And I know that for me, that's one reason I keep coming back to the bike. So just a few more background slides. We've already talked about the first piece of terminology, people in larger bodies. That's a way that I like to refer to people I don't know that are in larger bodies. It's descriptive, but it's less charged than a word like fat. And I'll go out of order here and go over to obesity and overweight. I won't talk a lot about this, but the term obesity um, has some pretty racially charged and medically problematic background. And I encourage you to look into the racist history of the BMI and the term obesity, but I stay away from using it. And some people even consider it a slur at this point. So I really try not to use the word obesity. I don't, other than in describing it here, I don't use it. I also try not to use the words overweight or underweight because those words then assume that I have imagined what the correct weight for a person is, and that I think they're over it or under it. And so those are words I stay away from, but it's really hard because they're words that we commonly use to describe people in larger bodies. I've moved to using the other phrases that I think are a little more neutral. Again, these are not laws of nature, but I think they're good rules to live by. Health and fitness. I won't talk a lot about this. I'm not a health and fitness expert. I'm not a doctor. But I think we often equate body size with health and fitness. And I just encourage you to challenge that and to think about your own assumptions about what it means to be healthy and what it means to be fit, what it means to be a cyclist, and what it looks like in your head, and then think about, why is that? And that's all I have to say on that one. But you can do more reading on that if you'd like, or maybe you're a medical doctor, you know more than me. And then finally, joyful movement. I came into cycling not as a form of joyful movement. I approached it as a source of achievement, hope to me at that point, a hopeful source of weight loss. And eventually those motivators really ran out for me. They weren't going to be sustainable motivators that kept me coming back to biking. And I was really fortunate to, around the same time that I was kind of burning out of those motivations, find the term and the movement of joyful movement, that you approach any activity that you do because it feels good and it's joyful and it is a source of happiness, and not for some of those different motivators. For me, and we talk about it in the film a lot, I think joyful movement is a way to connect with people who don't already ride bikes, and to offer this as a potential way that they might find joyful movement. I think it's a lot more inclusive than some of the other types of motivators that we use to get people on bikes. So it's what keeps me going. Joy feels a lot more sustainable than like weight loss. So, um, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I'll touch on it. The fat spectrum comes from an American podcast host called Ash, and she talks about the scale of fatness and the idea that body size comes with privilege. So we can imagine, that people in smaller bodies may have some sources of privilege based on their body size, and then take that a step further and say, well, fat people have different sources of privilege based on how fat they are. And I want to acknowledge here that I am on the smaller end of this scale. And so what does that mean for me? It means I can find clothes at some stores. It means that often I don't exceed the weight limit of a bicycle, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. It means that a lot of the bike brands that provide clothing, when they add a size or two, all of a sudden I'm included. But a person larger than me, maybe they can't get on a bike because they exceed a weight limit. They can't find ample seating for themselves at events. They have trouble getting medical access. There's just so many more barriers for people based on how big they are. And it's worth noting and thinking about. And this only includes people in extended clothing sizes, but we know that this goes into straight clothing sizes as well. And then finally, on the background, I know I've just hit you with a bunch of kind of non-bike related things, but I promise it all connects. Is the idea that there's internal and external work. So we all probably are familiar with body positivity. It's been pretty popularized, and it's great work. The idea that we should all individually work to accept ourselves and either feel neutral or positive about our bodies. It's lifelong work of accepting ourselves really in the bodies that we're in. And it's powerful, and a lot of brands and companies have attached themselves to this and used it as a marketing tool. And there's a ton of good that has come from it. But I do want to point out that no matter how much body positivity you have for yourself, there are still institutional and structural barriers for people in larger bodies that they will face no matter how much they love themselves. And so it's not, the work can't stop at body positivity. It has to go further. Here in the US, there's only a couple of states in which people in larger bodies are protected by discrimination law. So people can be let go from a job because they are in a larger body, and that would be legally defensible. There are clear barriers to healthcare. Many doctors won't even see patients of a certain weight. People in larger bodies often don't receive the correct healthcare. And then there's physical barriers of just navigating a world that's built for people in smaller bodies. And so that really comes into play when we talk about biking and how to make it more inclusive. There are physical barriers in a sport that requires that we have this bike. And it's worth talking about and noting. And the good news is companies are listening and working on it. So community building. This picture I love if you're familiar with the Radical Adventure Riders. This was a summit a couple years back in Oregon of some of the folks in that group. And that was the first time that I ever talked about body size inclusion to an audience, was at this wonderful summit. So there's tons of great communities out there doing work, and I'm just going to talk about some ways that we can make our bike rides more inclusive, and some communities that we can learn from. So if you've ever been on a group ride, you probably are familiar with some of the jitters that come post or pre-group ride. And if you're not, maybe you're just super fast and you know you're going to be able to keep up with any ride. But I know for me that going to group rides can often be pretty nerve-wracking. And so Marley and I have come up with this list of ways that we can, as organizers of group rides, hopefully make them feel more inclusive. So one of those is to advertise the pace that you're going at, and and as hard as it is, try to stick to it. It is really hard to stick to a pace, but being honest about it and then sticking to it is really key. Publishing your route ahead of time. Sometimes people like to build some mystery into like, where are we going? And if you're pretty clear and open about that, and you're transparent about the rest of the stuff on this list, that could be fine. But a lot of people have some stress about not knowing where they're going to go and where they're going to end up. So it helps to share maybe a GPS file, or maybe just an image of the route. Have a sweeper in the back that knows the route and is committed to staying at the back. That's pretty key. A lot of people do this, but just making sure that that person remains at the back and knows who's in the group. Regrouping at the top of hills to give people a chance to rest. If you've ever been the slowest person in a group, you know that that person that is the slowest is probably working the hardest, has the least amount of break, because they get to the top and all the fast people are ready to go, and that person never gets a break. So just making sure that everybody gets a chance to rest. And then this last one, it's um, a little less obvious, but dropping things like descriptions like beginner or experienced from your group rides, and instead using the pace and distance as descriptors, is a really powerful shift. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but I'll use myself as an example. I am a pretty slow rider. I've been riding for a long time. I don't consider myself a beginner by any means, but I probably would choose the slower or smaller distance ride if there were options. And that term beginner then makes me feel like, okay, well, I don't really feel like a beginner, and I might not come to that ride. The opposite could be true. You might have a brand new cyclist who's really fast and wants to go on a long ride, but doesn't feel advanced. And if you use that word or experience in the title, then maybe they're too worried to go to the ride that might work for them. And so getting rid of terms like that, and then also getting rid of our judgments and the things that we say on group rides. On almost every group ride I've ever gone on in my life, somebody that I don't know will ask me if I just started riding a bike, or if I'm just getting into cycling for the first time. And they're making an assumption based on what I look like, that I don't ride bikes very much. And so that just makes me feel, again, like an outsider. And so thinking about the things we say to each other on group rides is super important. So often, if we're hosting group rides, or even if we're not, we're also hosting in-person events. Not so much right now, but in the future, hopefully we'll be hosting in-person events. And if we do, things to consider: chairs, especially for outdoor events. Flimsy chairs that cannot hold a lot of weight, or that have arms on the side, are super limiting for people in larger bodies, and mean that they might not feel comfortable to sit or stay at your event. Making sure that there's space between seating. This is an accessibility issue, and it's also an issue for people in larger bodies. And I won't go through all of these, but one thing to note is that we've done a great job moving to virtual events during Zoom, or during COVID with Zoom. But I encourage you to think of ways to make your events hybrid in the future, because it is an accessibility issue for a lot of people, that they might prefer to join an event via Zoom, even if the in-person option exists. So I just want to shout out a few of the existing communities that came along before we started doing the All Bodies on Bikes work. And these are the groups that gave me inspiration and courage to speak out in the biking space. These are all US groups, I'm sure. I know there's Fat Lad at the back, and there's other, European and UK based groups, but for me, Unlikely Hikers and Fat Girls Hiking, they have chapters, actually, both of them, all over the world. So they might have chapters near you. And also Climb Big, which is pictured here. And then the last one is Body Positive Movement. And that's like exercise classes for folks in larger bodies. These groups are pretty specific to catering to folks in larger bodies rather than just, making a space inclusive for all body size. And that's what's worked really well in those outdoor recreation spaces. We have done some of that, but most of the group rides and events that we do are open to people of all sizes. And it's worked really well in cycling to do it that way. But who's to say what might work in every area? What works in the Pacific Northwest might not be what works for you all. So being an ally. So if you're here today and you're a person in a smaller body, thank you for taking the time to listen to the experiences of people in a larger body and thinking about what it means and trying to create inclusive community for people in larger bodies. That's huge. That's being an ally. I also know that people have some questions about ways that they could be an ally to their friends or family. Um, I think a huge thing is to communicate with each other. This is probably something we could all do regardless of our body size. And I know from riding with lots of different people that I sometimes forget to communicate with the people I'm riding with. It could be easier when we're forming a group ride and we're advertising it and it's a little more formal to stick to those 5 rules that were on that previous slide. But it's a lot harder when you're just going out with a friend or family member to remember that you should communicate the ride length and communicate about whether or not you want to stick together or if you're going to wait at a hill. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have gone out on a ride with friends and been left in the dust and truly just wondered if I'm ever going to see them again until the end of the day. And that some days that might be what the people you're riding with want. Maybe you do not need to ride with each other all day, but you don't know that unless you talk to each other. So, just talk before your rides. And that's also a reminder to me because I still don't always remember to do that. And I think if we do that more, everybody in all body sizes will have a better time. Um, Speaking up in groups or calling ahead, I'll kind of smush those together. Um, this is the idea that you can advocate for your friends and family in larger bodies by kind of sticking your neck out in a situation where it's a little uncomfortable, because you have privilege as a person in a smaller body to say, hey, are there any bigger sizes of this, or do you have any strong or better chairs? I really don't like these chairs. And rather than putting it on the person in the larger body, to do that work, you can, call ahead if you're going to rent bikes and your friend might be concerned about the weight limit of the bikes that you're going to rent. And then we've already talked about compliments in the form of kind of microaggressions, but just another example, people, a lot of times people will say to me or to other people, other fat people, oh, you're so confident. You're so confident for wearing that outfit, or you're so confident for wearing bike clothes. Suggesting to me in that comment, anyways, that if they looked like me, they wouldn't ride a bike or they wouldn't wear the outfit I have, etc. So, just another example of calling those types of compliments out and thinking about ways that we can make compliments to people that we would make across the board. I like your helmet, cool gloves, those types of things. Clothing and equipment. So here are some of my favorite bike specific clothing brands that have extended sizing. Um, these brands, all of these brands go at least to a 3XL. Some of them are Sports and Aerotech, are 2 triathlon brands that go to a 6XL. Are those kind of standard sizing in the UK as well? I hope. that's pretty typical to use that type of sizing. Fat Lad at the back has a more European sizing structure, but they also go at least to a 3XL. And because of shipping constraints, they might be the best option for people in the UK to get extended size cycling apparel. But all of these brands offer them. So if you take a screenshot, or I can send you these names later. And then these are some of the brands that provide other forms of outdoor gear. If you're a bike packer, that's what I like to do. Maybe you need a raincoat or a puffy jacket. And these brands all now go to 2 or 3X. Super Fit Hero actually goes to 7XL, and they especially focus on clothing for people in extended sizes. But all of these brands are decent bets. They're getting even better in terms of providing some more like holistic gear for people in larger bodies, aside from just padded bike shorts. And then equipment considerations. So I've mentioned structural weight limits of bikes a couple times now, but if you know what that is, it might be old news. For me, it was brand new news, even after many years of riding bikes, that I actually exceeded the weight limit of one of my bicycles. Especially carbon bikes have pretty limiting weight limits, sometimes less than 250 pounds. I know that might not be transferable. I should have looked up what it is. So maybe we can do some quick math, but 250 pounds, a lot of bikes go to 300 pounds now. And that might include a lot more people, but it doesn't include everyone. Steel bikes tend not to have weight limits. So if you are a person in a larger body or looking to get a friend or family onto a bike, a steel bike might be a really safe and good option. But it's important to consider that wheels have often a more restrictive weight limit than bike frames. And also that components that are weight bearing, things like pedals, I find that things like brakes tend to wear through faster for me than my friends in smaller bodies. So it's not the end of the world, but it is extremely important that people in larger body be made aware that they might need to change out their brake pads a little bit more frequently than a person in a smaller body. That's not horrible, it's not that expensive, but it's just really important, and it's a safety issue that we inform people of that. And physical considerations. What I mean here is essentially that a bike can be extremely modified, and for people in larger bodies, it might make sense to add spacers so that the handlebars are more raised, so that their stomach isn't as leaned over into their legs. It's really up to personal preference. I actually love riding way more leaned over and engaging my core in that way. And yeah, my stomach hits my legs when I pedal, but it doesn't bother me. For some people, that is a really big bother. And so there's adjustments that can be made to the bike that'll make it much more comfortable and experience for them. So I wanted to just touch on some of our current initiatives that Marley and I are working on. Actually, tomorrow, and it probably will fall in the middle of the night for you all, we'll be doing a biking for bigger people class, which is a workshop we do specifically for people in larger bodies to learn how to purchase a bike and what information to look up and what to ask so that they get a bike that's safe and comfortable. But we do offer that class every so often at different times, and we try to make them work for people in different time zones across the world. So stay tuned for more of those coming up. And then we've got our Instagram page if you're on there and don't follow already. And then the Facebook community. I know Facebook's kind of falling out of fashion, but it's also called All Bodies on Bikes, and it's the reason I stay on Facebook. All we did was start a page, and now there's like over 2,000 people on there, just of all different body sizes and all different walks of life, sharing their stories. It's so motivational, and people are just hyping each other up. It's like the best version of what the internet could be. So I encourage you to go on there if you're on Facebook. And then we've been doing group rides pretty much everywhere we've traveled. We've just done one in Portland. Marley will be doing one in Boston, Massachusetts, and hopefully as COVID restrictions change in the future, we'll be able to do some of those trips in other countries. But we're also working on creating chapters of all bodies on bikes in different parts of the world so that other people can lead these rides and create this kind of in-person community where they live. So with that, I can leave it and I'll open it up to questions. I know I didn't talk much about marketing, but we can do that if people care to talk about it. And otherwise, I'll just let you all carry the conversation where you want it to go.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Really wonderful. Cool. So we've got some questions that we've written up already. So we'll kick off with them if that's all right. And then if anybody's got any other questions, as we said, pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A as well. We'll definitely read those out once we've gone through the questions that we've got sorted.
I was just going to say, actually, Lorna, so someone's posted a question already and someone else has got their hand raised in the chat. So maybe we can go to them and then we can
Let's do it.
So I'll just read out what someone's written in the Q&A box. If you want to add your own question in the Q&A, it's just on the bottom toolbar next to where it says raise hand. There's a little bit you can add in there. So someone's asked, I gave up riding 2 years ago because of a comment like that. Was told in one cycling clothing store that they don't cater for my size. I would say I'm mid-fat and just wanted to continue cycling during the winter. They told me to come back when I'd been cycling longer. I had been for 6 years and was a real cyclist, in brackets, smaller. I was also told in group rides that if I just worked harder, I would see weight loss. Wasn't riding for anything but joy and have lost all the joy I used to get. I never held anyone back while group riding, but I embarrassed them with my size. I want to start again, but don't know where to start when it comes to clothes or confidence.
Gosh, I'm so sorry to hear about those experiences. That's just really awful. I hope in terms of clothing that there's some quick fixes. And if for this person, if you do have specific questions about certain sizing and you want to reach out to me directly, we can talk about some specific recommendations for certain, size ranges. I have found that the clothing has become a bit better. When I started riding, I was smaller than I am now, and I was at the upper limit of the clothing that was available to me. And as I've grown, so has the clothing, but it's not perfect. And I think for folks that are in sizes larger than 3XL, it's really, there's just one or two brands out there that do a good job of providing padded shorts. And really our sports is the one that I tend to lean on, and they're US based, but I know that they do sell internationally. And then I don't want to miss out on all the parts of this question, so I just pulled it up. I think in terms of the confidence, obviously that's much more challenging and complex than just finding shorts that fit. Although I know how frustrating it can be just to find the shorts. For me, finding the online community of other people that looked like me that were biking has been really helpful. And that Facebook and Instagram page do really help me because I live in a pretty small town. There aren't that many other people in larger bodies that ride bikes. So the reality is, like, when I go, I'm usually with mostly people in smaller bodies. And it can be hard to feel like you're part of the community, even if those people are super inclusive of me. And so the online community has really helped. The other thing that I know the Facebook group has done is connect people to each other. So people have made biking friends through the Facebook group and been able to ride together. And that's been helpful for people, unlike you, who are just getting into cycling, but I think also people who have had to leave cycling for lack of confidence or community. I don't know if I hope that helps a little bit. I also hope that people, the people who have been acting like that, start to hear the messages that folks are putting out. That one, it's not okay, and it's also inaccurate to be saying those types of things to people, and it has a huge impact. The goal is to get more people on bikes, and it's amazing what one comment in a bike shop or one comment on a group ride can do to a person. And that is just, it's devastating to hear. And I think I'm just so sorry that happened to you, and I hope we can ride together someday.
I'll pass on now to Lindsay, who's got their hand raised so they can ask their question. So I'll just allow you to talk now, Lindsay. You should be able to unmute if you'd like to ask your question. Perhaps if it's okay, Lindsay, we'll just move on. And then if you could post in the chat when you're ready to ask, we can come back to you. So we'll just go on to the next question in the Q&A. Someone's written, firstly, thank you. This was so great. As a mid-fat person, I do struggle with climbing due to my extra weight. Do you have any tips for easier climbing?
It's a good question. I'm not the best climber in the world, and largely because of my body size. You know, it just, for folks in smaller bodies or folks in larger bodies who haven't put it together, it takes a lot more output of energy and strength to make a larger body climb a hill than it does a smaller. And so it is actually more physically challenging for people in larger bodies to climb hills. Mentally, what I do with that information is that instead of letting it discourage me, I try to think of it as an empowering thing, that, you know, I'm climbing this hill and I'm putting out more watts, if that matters. You know, if you're a person who looks at watts and output on a bike, if you're into metrics, or just the fact that, yeah, you're putting out a lot of power to make your bike go up a hill, and it is hard. But you're able to do it. I think that's how I encourage myself. I also use a method Marley calls the one tree method. So she looks at a tree and tries to say, okay, just climb to that tree, and then you could take a break or maybe pick another tree and keep climbing. But I will say, for me, things that have made it easier, I have a lighter bike now than when I started, and that has really helped. You know, I haven't gotten lighter, but my equipment has, so that does help. And also I've changed the gearing on my bike to be in low enough gears that climbing, I don't have to get off my bike as much to walk. Because I have lower gears that are easier for me to climb in. So that's made it more fun to try to climb, because I am able to stay on my bike. But I will say I walk all the time, and especially bike packing, like everybody walks. And I think maybe that's why I like bike packing the most, because it's just about getting there. And, you know, I call it my rolling backpack if I walk my bike, because it has all my stuff. It's a lot easier than carrying it all on your back. And, you know, if you have to walk, it's all about just being out in nature and experiencing, or being out in your city, wherever you are, and experiencing that, and not as much about, like, you know, getting down on yourself for having to walk. Like, sometimes it feels really good to get off the saddle and move your legs a little in a different way. But I think I have noticed that every year that I bike, I don't know if I get physically better at climbing, but I get mentally better at climbing. Like, the climbs don't scare me as much, and I don't let them defeat me as much. But it's harder. I do acknowledge that. So if you have any tips for climbing, I would love to hear them. It'd be awesome to be like really good at climbing.
That's great. We've just got another question in the Q&A as well. So Angela's asked, I generally have a good time when riding, but I definitely have trouble with being body positive about myself, and I get really upset by photos of me after a ride. Any tips on not letting that steal the joy?
Gosh, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that for me, and I got this tip from somebody else, I have really transitioned my social media and who I follow, so that a lot of the people that I follow are people in larger bodies that are doing activities similar to me or different. I'm not much of a rock climber these days, but it's still helpful to see other larger bodies in motion. We don't see a lot of pictures of people in larger bodies, and there's lots of reasons for that. And so we are conditioned to imagine a certain type of person doing an activity. And when we then see ourselves in a picture and we don't really look like that, and this goes for everybody, not just people in larger bodies, I think it's emotionally damaging. It's really difficult to stay body positive in that environment. And so I do think in this age of social media, it's important to think about how we're curating our own experience on social media to make it so that when we do see a picture of ourselves, now when I see pictures of myself, they look a lot like the pictures I see on my social media of other people doing the activities. They have stomach fat rolls and they've got, back fat showing in their sports bra or whatever it might be. And it looks a lot like the picture that I just took. And, you don't have to post pictures, but even just kind of seeing them and getting more comfortable with the way that larger bodies look, that helps me a lot. But again, like, I don't want to make it sound like I have body positivity all figured out. I think it would be wrong to assume that I have like the perfect confidence about my body every day. It is just as hard for me to gain body positivity and self-confidence as anybody else. So I think we're all just struggling through it.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Yeah, I can agree. It feels really powerful, doesn't it? Cultivating your social media feed. It feels like you're kind of like getting a grip on the machine that seems to be taking up so much of your energy anyway. You're like fighting back. It's great.
Totally.
Fantastic. So we've had some really lovely comments here in the chat. We've got a note from Mahnor, who I know she does a lot of work with Bike for Good. She's actually a ride leader here, and she said it's lots of points to think about and to keep in mind when she's diversitizing that making rides more diverse, which is a really good point. Yeah, that was really useful sort of practical information that you gave us there, so that's wonderful. So if any folk have any other questions, again, just pop them in the chat. But if not, we can just go through some questions that we've got sort of aside as well.
Yeah.
So I'll just pull them up.
While you're doing that, I see someone in the chat has asthma, and I also have asthma, and that can make climbing hills that much more challenging. And I think it's a struggle to find the pace where you don't, for me, sometimes my asthma is exercise induced and I can't push past a certain point. Finding that point where I can't push past has been a lifelong journey, not just on the bike, but the bike has really helped me to navigate and figure out what that point is and really figure out, what can I do to not avoid using my inhaler, but to stay within my own limits before needing my inhaler. And, communicating that too with the other people on your ride, I think is really crucial. When I go bike packing, I tell people where my inhaler is in my bags, just in case something were to happen and I need them to find it for me. And so you can view it as a limitation. I try not to, but I do acknowledge that it's part of my physical journey on the bike. So I really feel that, though. It comes into play on climbs in a big way.
I'm sure. We've just had another note saying it's been super inspiring and someone's super excited to jump on their bike at the weekend, which is oh, someone's asked, when will you be visiting Scotland or Glasgow for a bikepacking trip?
It's like I'm not just saying this, it is my dream, my biggest dream, to go biking in Scotland. So I just got married this summer, and we're hoping that soon we can do a honeymoon trip biking there, and I would love to meet you all. But yeah, I am jealous. I know we have great biking in Oregon, but I'm so jealous of the biking you all have. So looking forward to getting to try it.
Amazing. You'll definitely have to stop by Back for Good and say hi.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty gorgeous. Can't lie. It's pretty gorgeous around here. Can't deny it. Amazing. So I know that you've sort of touched on it a little bit already, but can you speak a bit about how your work has progressed with Marley since the video? I think it was in March the video was made, is that right?
Yeah, man, it has really taken over in a way, and in this great way. I did not ever imagine that I'd be giving talks to people all over the world, and working with some of the companies that I've, admired and aspired to buy things from, while I've been biking. And yeah, I think getting to work with people who work in bike shops, we've really been able to do a ton of work with people who have a big impact on some people who are just joining cycling, or people who are accessing a bike shop for the first time or the 30th time. People that have a huge impact on our experiences and how we feel about biking, and been able to share this message with them and talk about ways that they can talk about body size in a bike shop, or ways to engineer a bike that has a higher weight limit, or the fact that 3XL is not a big enough clothing size, and brands are really listening. And so I think in lots of other work, there's a lot that can be done to shift culture, but the reality is with body size, we do also need to shift like the physical manufacturing. And it can be a little bit weird because we're trying to do this community building work that sometimes flies in the face of working with big brands. But the reality is that we have to do that work so that there's the equipment to allow for that inclusive community. And this is where I'll talk about marketing a little bit. We have also been working to influence marketing, and I know there's been a lot of communication and great messages about the fact that just including people of color, or people of all ages or genders in marketing is not enough, right? We know that is just performative, and it's not often followed by action. But it's also important that people of all body sizes and races and ethnicities and genders see themselves doing this activity in the photos and video that are promoted, so that they know they're invited. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. And we've been working with companies to not just show a picture of a person in a larger body on a bike, but actually do the work of making the products for those people, and then putting the pictures on their advertisements. And I think the companies are really responding to that. But I love talking to communities of people like you all the most. I think it's so energizing. Like, I want to go jump on my bike right now, and it's so amazing to connect with other people and hear, how they're affected by riding their bike. And so we're getting to do that a lot. This week alone, I have 4 talks about bikes. So I think it's a lot of stuff, but it's all just so positive. I am very grateful to have the kind of platform to share this message, and share what I've learned from a lot of other people that did a lot of hard work before me.
That's great to hear. I feel like we should do more talks where we have like a lead ride afterwards. We can like really get that kind of energy that all go out. That'd be great. So we sent it over the resource list that was included on the website as well. And so for everyone who signed up on the Eventbrite, you should have got that as a link, but we can resend it at the end afterwards. And then part of that included some like film and TV things, references. But someone has asked as well if there are any podcasts or books that you would recommend.
Yeah, I am just finishing the book, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. That is a really great book that just came out by, if you're on Instagram and you follow Your Fat Friend, she probably has the biggest following of any fat advocate, and posts really the most progressive. She's kind of the most progressive thinker that I follow about these topics, constantly pushing people to examine their own fat phobia, about other people and also about themselves. And really an amazing book. The Fat Lip podcast is a great one. And Maintenance Phase is actually the author of the book I was just talking about. It's her podcast. Those are two really good ones. I will say I stay away from podcasts sometimes, because they can be a bit triggering for me. I mentioned in the film that I struggle with disordered eating. So I just caution people that podcasts about these topics or this talk itself can be a bit, triggering, or maybe force some thoughts that you're not ready to have. The book for me was a more gentle way to do this, because you can set it, I guess you can stop the podcast, but it seems to happen faster with the book. I can set it down and come back when I'm ready. And the Instagram, I feel the same, where it's a little bit more at my speed, because I choose to go look at their page when I'm in the mood. I guess you can do that with podcasts too. It's funny, I listen to podcasts very scheduled, like every morning at a certain time. So sometimes I feel like they ruin my day, because I'm like, hey, I didn't ask for this today. But those are what I'm listening to and following. And I think we've got a list of stuff like that I can send along to.
That would be great. Yeah, please do. We'll just go on to, oh, we've got another question. Sorry, I'll go into this first. What's been your favorite multi-day bike trail that you've done?
I love the one that's in the film. It's called the Sea to Sea. It goes from my town, Corvallis, to the ocean, which is really special. We live like a 45-minute drive to the coast, but it's through a mountain range. And being able to bike there on like gravel and single track trails is pretty incredible, because it's like a highway drive normally to get there. So I do really love that. And I think one of the more unique trails I did was in southern Arizona, right along the US-Mexico border. And it's like a 4-day ride. And I loved it because the plants are so different. I live in like a rainforest and it's the desert. But it was also, it was a pretty heartbreaking trip, because you get to experience the militarization of the US side of that border. And right now, I went during the Trump administration. It was really, we see in the media, but it's different being there with helicopters and trucks and people who are, trying to navigate through that landscape. That's a really challenging landscape on foot. And we're in that same place recreating in that same landscape. And what does that mean? And kind of grappling with that. It's in a different way was one of my favorite trips, because I really like to go to landscapes that are experiencing something like climate change or some humanitarian crisis, and spend time there on a bike, because you're grounding yourself in it in a way that's so different than just like reading about it. But what does it mean to be recreating and experiencing joy where so many people have died trying to cross this militarized border? So that goes kind of dark, but I encourage people to, if you have the opportunity to come to the US and ride, that ride is called the Sky Island Odyssey, and it's on bikepacking.com. It's a really wonderful ride and also just an eye-opening experience.
Great, thank you. One question that we would like to ask was, is there anything that you'd recommend to someone who's looking to combat their own struggles with the stigma that society can bring towards fat people on bikes?
Yeah, I think for me, the cure has been to bike. um, it has been a long journey of feeling not so good about myself on my bike for the first, few years really of biking, of feeling down about how slow I was or what my body was or wasn't capable of or what it looked like on the bike compared to what other people look like when they're biking. And For me, considering joy as my motivator has been the biggest shift because um, the reality is I love biking. It's my favorite way to travel through landscapes and to spend time with other people, and and it focuses much less than on my body. Other than that, I'm joyful that my body allows me to do the thing that I'm doing. Um, I don't think it works all the time, and I think there's still sometimes where I see a picture of myself or it was really hard for me to climb that hill that I can't help but think like, why am I why is my body this size? Sometimes I still wonder about why my body never did get smaller when I started biking and why it seems not to. I try to combat that thought, but I think that's natural to think, why do other people's bodies respond differently to this activity than mine? Um, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but whenever people ask me a question along those lines, I always get more jumbled because I think that the reality is I don't have a good answer. And I think I'm still navigating, but I know that joyful movement has been a game changer for me in terms of my paradigm about biking.
I think that was a wonderful answer anyway. Yeah, and absolutely, it's so wonderful to see people championing sports not in a competitive way, in a way that's just about the joy and about the pleasure of it. You just rarely see that, I guess. It's always so wonderful to see. We've just had, this wasn't a question, but a lovely comment. So many useful things to keep in mind, break down barriers. You're explaining it so well, and thank you for championing the joy of cycling.
Thank you.
Sweet. So another question that we had. So we loved your reclaiming of the word fat. What has been people's reactions to your stripping it of its negative sort of connotations when you've used it in situations?
Yeah, it's interesting. I I don't want to make overgeneralizations, but I have found that younger people have responded pretty quickly to thinking of the term differently. I think especially this most recent generation is really used to thinking critically about what terms mean and changing their use of words to reflect their values. And I think that for people in my parents' age or older, these ideas about body size and about the word fat and the value of bodies based on size is really deep seated. I don't know if that's true around the world, but it's definitely true in where I'm from. Um, and so what's interesting is that like last night I spoke to a group of mostly older people, and when I use the word fat, they respond with things like, "Oh, you're not fat. You're just like big boned," or they'll hear my message, but sometimes people will resist using the word still. They'll hear what I'm saying, but they'll resist saying the word fat. Um, that word, I think when we think about it, we are surprisingly uncomfortable with using the word fat. And I know, reading books like What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, the author of that book is queer, and she talks about claiming the word felt a lot like coming out. And so calling herself fat publicly felt like coming out as queer to her family and friends. And I don't know that experience personally, but it really does feel like, even though everybody can see you, they know that you're fat, it does feel like you're pronouncing something that has been this unspoken thing for so long, that you're claiming it. And part of it is that the word calling yourself fat assumes that it's in some way a permanent state of being, and it's something that you are. And we have so long considered people that are fat to be people that are transitioning to being thin eventually. And so changing the way we use it as a descriptor of people is also changing how we view people who are fat. And I think that that is really challenging for people who grew up thinking that a fat person's mission is to become a thin person. And I get it. It is uncomfortable. I don't think that people should use it if they're not ready to, but that's just some of my rambling thoughts about that. I'm loving these comments. I'm reading in the chat.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. It's really lovely to see what everyone's had to say. And yeah, obviously, thank you again, Kailey.
Thank you so much.
It's really interesting. I think that idea of like coming out. I think any way of like putting yourself forward in any aspect of your identity, it's a real emotional process to go through. One thing that Lorna and I were discussing earlier when we were rewatching the film was how you first talk about in the film viewing cycling as a sort of form of punishment, and obviously now I've moved towards seeing it much more as a thing of enjoyment, and that you were talking about like the joy, moving and joy and different aspects of that. And I'm curious to know how you sort of found that journey, how that process was for you. Did you ever consider abandoning cycling altogether once you'd acknowledged your negative mindset around it, and how did you manage to move past that?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if I considered fully quitting cycling, because there's an aspect of cycling that is just logistical. Like I use my bike to get to work and the grocery store. And for those reasons, like I don't think I could ever stop riding. And there's some beauty to that, because I have quit other sports in the past because of that punishment mindset. And, I used to rock climb a lot, and I quit cold turkey because of that mindset and never came back to it, because you don't need to rock climb to get to work, And I think there's beauty in the utility of cycling that makes it so that regardless of how you feel about your body that day, you have to ride. And that probably kept me going through the tough times. But really, for me, and I will get personal and slightly in the realm of disordered eating, but I was very fortunate to go to a doctor when I was practicing disordered eating that recognized it for what it was and sent me to a nutritionist and therapist that she was a health at every size practitioner, someone who preached intuitive eating and joyful movement. And she brought me into this group therapy that she had been running that was all about those two concepts, and all for people in larger bodies. And most of it was about intuitive eating, which was great because I needed help with intuitive eating, certainly. But there was that small part about joyful movement. And for me, that part became this huge kind of now this huge part of my life, because it was right before I went to Alaska that I did that group therapy. And it really was such a pivotal change, because then when I went on that trip, which was my longest and most public facing bikepacking trip, I had this new perspective on what riding a bike was about, that wasn't about punishment, and it was tied to intuitive eating and a different mindset about my body size. And I think that combination, that was kind of the sweet spot, because that's from there, that was when things really took off, and people have responded to that message in the same way that I responded to when I heard it, which is like, oh, this is something, we've got something here. So really, it was all luck and opportunity and privilege that I had access to that healthcare and the privilege to have time to think about those things. And so that was the change, but many years in that punishment mindset.
Fab, thank you. So yeah, once again, if anyone has any questions to ask, well, I'll just read. I'm sure you can read it yourself, but just Elizabeth saying thank you so much. They're showing their video to their friends, so they might feel able to be excited about being on a bike as she does when she watched the film. She's also a climber. And feel like the body shaming come hand in hand with cycling and climbing at the moment, unfortunately. But absolutely loving communities of people that are coming out and reclaiming those spaces for everyone. Thank you for your words and good luck with your PhD. Yeah, amazing. Can I ask what you're studying as your PhD? Is it anything to do with
Yeah. No, I study forest management, and in the US we have these huge swaths of publicly owned forest land, and there's a lot of members of the public who want to be engaged in how that land is managed, and the agencies haven't quite figured it out of how they incorporate those folks from the public. So I work, my research is on how they do that, and I also work with one of the forests here doing that, and kind of incorporating public engagement. So very different, but it's about the forest that I spend the most time biking in. So that's how I connect it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I bet they're so useful for each other. What you're studying must be so useful for riding, and you're riding for what you're studying. That's fantastic. I'll just hop over to some of the questions that we had. So you've said already that you found people through social media. And have you experienced any other means of connecting with fellow cyclists? And are there any people or accounts you can recommend us to follow? I know you've already recommended a few.
Yeah, I really have loved group rides when they're done well as a way to meet more people on bikes. I'm lucky to have a bike club in my kind of town and region that is very inclusive and does a great job, and I've met a lot of people that way. And then, I take trips to like the bigger cities around me to meet people that look a bit more like me, because there's just more people that, there's a greater chance that there will be some other people like me. And so I do that as a way to meet people in person. And then the second part of your question is escaping me.
Oh, that's fine. It's just, can you recommend any people or?
Oh, yes. Yes. So I would say you should definitely follow Marley Blonsky. Can I type her name? She's the other person in the film, and she is really great at social media, much better than me, and she posts much more and shares resources all the time. She's just really great. And then there's another person, I want to spell her name right, so I'm gonna look on my phone really quick for it. Her name is Myrna, and this is her Instagram, the Myrna Vader. She started as a runner, and she's also a person in a larger body, and got into biking and swimming as well, and has been doing a ton of biking now. And I really like her because Marley and I have been biking for a long time, but Myrna's new to it, so she brings a different perspective of a new person in a larger body getting into this right now and what that looks like. So those are two of the people I'd recommend that are specific to biking. And then on our Instagram, the All Bodies on Bikes, we try to share people's stories each week, and so hopefully there's more people to follow, kind of each week. So, yeah.
Cool. I follow the motivator and she's brilliant. You can
She's so great.
She's so great. You can like see her like enthusiasm, like you say, because she's new to it. You can just see how she's like, oh my God, I just did this today. It was so great. Please.
It's awesome. Yeah, I just love it. I feel like she also has a different audience that isn't all bikers, so I know that she's just like having a huge impact.
Yeah. Oh, that's so wonderful. Fab, we've had another little question here. If you could only pick one, what would you pick? Road or off-road cycling?
Oh, I'm probably off-road. Yeah, I really love gravel biking, and I recently, in the last couple years, have started to mountain bike, and really liking that because it's like a roller coaster. And but I do love road biking. I guess I don't know, because then how would I get to work? Maybe I'd have to pick road biking or I wouldn't be able to get to my job. So oh, that's a tough question. There's just so many different ways to enjoy a bicycle.
Oh, that's great. We've just got one last pre-prepared question. So if anyone else has any more, please feel free to put them in the chat. It's really great to see more people who are advocating for cycling as a way of like enjoyment and just getting into it rather than competition-based advocating in like, yeah, competition-based sports. Are there any other people that you'd recommend to follow or be aware of who are shouting about enjoyment rather than competition, either in cycling or just more generally?
Yeah, I think I'll put more people in the chat. Jenny Russo is the person who runs Unlikely Hikers, and she probably was the first person that I'm aware of that was doing that type of work in recreation spaces. She is a backpacker and hiker, not a biker, but she, on the page Unlikely Hikers, shares spelled hikers wrong, but you probably could. She shares people's experiences of all different types of sports, and she just has been really paved the way for people like me to even talk about this stuff in any of the other spaces. So I really recommend her. And then in terms of just joy, I'm sure more people will come to me. I mean, there's so many people out there, and there are a bunch of people who are cycling racers who also promote these messages. And I think one of the most rewarding things for me has been hearing from some of those racers about what our film and this message means to them. People that I thought, like, in some ways were completely opposed in their motivation and in the way that they rode their bike and the way that their bodies work, and instead we've all kind of connected. Like, the message of joy of riding bikes connects everybody, even if we do ride our bikes really differently. Um, so I don't know the names of lots of cycling racers because that's never been something that I've known much about, but I certainly don't mean to say that just because they race doesn't mean that they don't share those types of messages too. I think they do. I know they're thinking about it.
Fab. We just had 2 extra questions added in, which is wonderful, and we've only got 6 minutes left, so I'll just I'll go through them quickly. I'll ask Lindsay's one actually, because I know that she'd had her hand up before. She was wondering if you also enjoy solo bike trips. She went on one last year and found the fact of doing it alone was really empowering, and it was really good to go at her own pace. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's awesome. I know a lot of people have experienced that. I have maybe embarrassingly not done much solo bike travel. I do challenge myself to go on day rides sometimes alone, but even that can be difficult for me. I find in all aspects of my life that I really rely on other people and like a social component to motivate myself. And um, I think it's a challenge to myself. I also am very like afraid of the dark. So I really like other people being around on multi-day trips for that reason, but I think it would be certainly probably one of the more empowering things I could do to like go out on an overnight trip alone. And actually Marley does teach a class on riding alone on multi-day trips and has tips for that. And so she's done that more than me, but yeah, I really haven't done much of that, and that's so awesome that you have done that.
That goes quite well actually onto the other person's question was, do you have days where you just don't want to ride your bike? Sometimes I really don't feel like it, but I also know my mood always improves so much after a ride, and I've never regretted going out on a bike ride. But it's difficult to find a balance between being gentle and understanding with myself and resting versus motivating myself to go because it will make me feel better. Wondering if you have any thoughts or ways of navigating this. Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. I absolutely have days where I don't want to ride my bike, and I I like sometimes people ask me how many times a week or a month I ride my bike, and I like that question because I think from social media and for other reasons we assume sometimes that people ride a lot more than us, and I ride I go on a fun ride. I try to go once a week on like a ride just for fun. I commute almost every day, and for that reason, I do ride my bike when I don't want to sometimes. Um, but I am pretty gentle with myself about when I go biking. Both because I have a lot of work to do, and also because sometimes I don't physically feel like it. And I try not to force myself, even though I do totally agree with your point that when you go, you feel better. And so figuring out, when is it that I don't want to go legitimately, and when is it that I'm just, just need to like have a little bit of motivation to get out there and then I'll feel good. But the reality is that that's once or twice a week on a good week, that I'm able to do that. And that I have to tell myself all the time, that does not mean that you are not a cyclist. Just because you couldn't go the amount that you think in your head makes you a cyclist. This summer we've had a terribly hot summer here, and it's been unsafe to ride, at least for me. And grappling with the fact that I went weeks without having a recreational ride, that doesn't mean I'm not a cyclist. And so there's the aspect of pushing yourself to get out there when it's hard, but also just remember, if you don't get to ride as much as you think you're supposed to, you're a bike rider if you ride a bike. So so as from the movie. Yeah,